Welcome to Mind Meets Body and Soul, a podcast that connects the dots between clinical mental health and spiritual holistic wellness. I'm Heather, a licensed clinical social worker and mental health guru.
And I'm Devon, a Reiki master, spiritual teacher, and lover of all things woo-woo. We're here to discuss various wellness topics, highlighting the connection between the mind, body, and soul.
We'll be offering nuggets of wisdom from each of our fields with the ultimate goal of bridging the gap between our two worlds. Whether you lean more into cognitive psychology
or flow with the woo-woo waters, our intention is to help you prioritize yourself and unlock a fresh perspective to healing, growth, and expansion. We're so excited you're here. Let's jump in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Mind Meets Body and Soul. We are coming to you with episode 47. Heather here with my lovely co-host Devon. How's it going?
Hi, Heather. It's going well. Episode 47, we're making our way to what I'm coining our golden 50th episode. Excited to be here for another week, another episode, another great conversation. This has been a big week personally. I'm coming to you at the end of the week feeling a little groggy, some late nights, but exciting stuff.
Yeah, talk to us about what's been going on, because I've been seeing all of your posts and your content and newsletters that's been coming out, but you want to talk about what this week has been for you?
Yes, thank you. It is launch week or launch day actually of Empower Wellness Retreat, a 5-night all-inclusive retreat in the Costa Rican rainforest. So we were in the jungle in January. We'll be in the rainforest next March 2025. It is my first co-hosted retreat, and I'm really excited for it.
As you should be. I mean, I can only imagine, having never planned something like that, what has to go into it just to get it up and running and to launch it and to plan all of that. So I'm sure it's taking a lot of effort and energy and heart. And I'm sure, though, that will come back and it will be experienced on the receiving end, once you're there and everything's in place.
Thank you. Yeah, the planning process actually brought me back a year ago to when we were getting this whole podcast set up because, like any new venture, as we know as entrepreneurs as well, it's like you never know all that goes into something until you dive headfirst into it. And so I had no idea. Liz had no idea. My co host had no idea what was going to become of this retreat planning process and how much we actually had to do to prep it. So, yeah, that's why I'm a little bit groggy at this time, but it's all good. Doors are open for enrollment. We have people booking left and right, and we're really excited. It's a year out, and there's already a lot of excitement that is building. And so, yeah, newest enlighten and empower venture for me here.
It's really fun to think back a year in terms of like where we were, but also like all that's changed and come from this past year for like our podcast. But even like, I never thought I'd have a podcast, and here we are almost a year in. And I don't want to speak for you, but I don't know if you've ever imagined that you'd be planning a retreat, and like now here you are with a podcast and planning a retreat. Like, it's just cool to see how things happen over time.
You know, you're so right. And also, I remember 2 years ago, I mean, it's still on my vision board now. 2 years ago, when I created the vision board for my business, I had written down there podcast and I had retreat as well. So it's always been in my big picture vision. But you're so right. Like the fact that we have these big picture visions and then somewhere along the journey, it just becomes a natural part of what we're doing, podcast, retreat, etc. Like you, I think of the same thing with you in these corporate contracts, right? Like maybe that was a vision that you had for yourself at one point, and now it's a reality. Now you have two and counting, right? Two and coming.
Yeah, two and counting. So it is cool to think. For me, I think I'm less like, I'm still new in this like vision boarding foresight space. So I hadn't imagined a lot of these things, but I also never even thought when I was younger that I'd be a therapist, and here I am as a therapist with a business. Like, I more feel like I stumble into these things, but like you've said before, like in hindsight, it does feel like of course I'm doing these things because I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else.
Right. Yeah. Like there's no other path that I I see right now for Heather, you as a entrepreneur, as a therapist, as a leader in your field and whatnot. So really cool stuff. I think our vibes are a little bit different this week than last week. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. And I before we jump into anything else, I want to take a moment to celebrate you for being in the space where the things that have been on your vision board are now coming to fruition, and you've planted the seeds and you've done the work and you're still doing the work. I'm sure it's like you said, long, late nights. But I'm proud of you that you're here and you're doing these things, and the things that you've intended for yourself are like coming to fruition now. And I think that's really cool.
Thank you. I fully receive that and I appreciate that moment of celebration. We love to do that here in this podcast, in our relationship, which I'm always really grateful for. So thank you, Heather. Yes, it is not always easy. In fact, most of the times it's pretty challenging because we are starting something, building something from nothing but a vision and a whole lot of inspiration and heart that goes into it as well. And I think like now, this week, even though I've been grinding away on the retreat stuff, like the energy just feels a little bit different. And coming to this conversation with you, coming from the conversation that we were sharing last week, it feels a lot different as well. So, how are you doing since we last shared that conversation on adjusting your expectations and bringing in radical acceptance in your relationships?
I think I'm doing well with it. I've been thinking about it this week after having listened to that episode. And like I talked about in that episode, I do have these filters that my brain goes through before I say anything on this platform. One, that like I'm on a platform and the things I say will be out in public. And two, I know that I have clients that are listening, and like my rule following filter is like, don't say anything, not that I'm going to say anything bad, but like just don't talk about yourself. But you did send me a nice message after we recorded that episode. And I think it does feel important to flex sharing that human side. And I'm leaning into feeling good about having done that and like talked about myself. And it's just something that like doesn't come supernatural, but it does feel good to be able to like connect with you, to connect with our audience, and talk even in extremely vague terms about myself.
Thank you for bringing that in. Yeah, I just to give our audience a little bit of context, I messaged Heather shortly after and just saying that I felt a really big shift in energy from that conversation that we shared because Heather, that wasn't the first time that you talked about yourself in conversation, but it was just there's something different about this conversation where I felt like you really allowed yourself to be heard and to be vulnerable in a way that felt really helpful, reciprocal, even in the ways that we both show up in this podcast. Because I oftentimes do find it so easy to storytell and to use my own life. As I mentioned last week, I am my own best case study, right? To use my stories and my experiences, my journey as topics then that we can bring into conversation and talk about. And I mentioned to you, Heather, that while it's so easy for me to do that, and while it's so easy for me to take initiation in a conversation, in a business venture, whatever, I really do love and appreciate when I don't always have to be the one initiating or always be the one talking about myself, my experiences, or my clients or whatnot. And so just that moment of you coming in and allowing yourself to be vulnerable, it really helped me, helped our relationship. And I mean, that just kind of speaks to the conversations that we share on conscious relationships, intentional relationships. So big thank you.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that just because it feels natural for you to do something doesn't mean that it doesn't like cost you energy to still do that thing, you know? Like you are a natural initiator, a natural leader in that way, but it does still cost you that energy to come up with the ideas or actually go through with like the action of initiating them. So just because something is like natural to you doesn't mean that it isn't also equally as like tiring at times. And I do want to step up and show up in that way to reciprocate that. Now, having said that, we're here recording another episode where you're initiating the topic, but I will get there.
And I am initiating this topic today because I have a story to share. And it's not like this one took a whole lot of effort for me to think about. It happened last week, actually. And it was perfectly timed because it seemed like you were going through a little bit of turmoil and having some big aha moments and awakenings. And at the same time, I was going through that as well. Of course, we were just on very similar wavelengths here on this journey. And it was great to have the space for you to share last week. And this week, we'll talk about my shitstorm and my aha moments.
Yeah. So, as we say, you want to just jump in?
Yeah, let's jump in. All right. So I'm going to set the scene. For those who follow me on social media, you may have seen this in my stories. Heather, I don't even know if you have seen this part, but last week I was having what I call to be a shitstorm of a week. It was just a week where I was feeling so overwhelmed by how fast everything seemed to be moving. I feel like I have been kind of called to step into this next level version of myself personally, professionally. And I've found myself kind of in this in between stage of like where I was and where I'm headed. And I'm just kind of like flailing around, messily navigating this void space or this in between space. And so throughout the week, things left and right were like just either going wonky or activating me in some way. Emotions were running high. And last week, it was Thursday morning. I took my dog out, took Ellie out for a walk in the morning, get back to the door from in the garage to the house, and I find that the door is locked. I accidentally locked myself out of the house. Normally, not an issue. Normally, there is a spare key in the garage, but spare key wasn't there because a few days prior I used the spare key and then I left it in the house. So now I'm locked out of the house. It's like 10 o'clock in the morning with my dog, no key, no cell phone because I didn't have my cell phone on me. Luckily, there is a landline in the garage, and I call my mom because she's on vacation. So I call her, and it's the only phone number that I memorize. And she's like, "Well, Devon, I don't know what to tell you. You're gonna have to go to the locksmith, pay for a new key." And I'm like, "Well, yeah, I could do that, but I don't have my car keys, my wallet, my cell phone, literally nothing, just me and my dog, and luckily this landline phone." And so then we're like just kind of brainstorming. We do have a family friend who has a spare key. So we're like, okay, game plan. You're going to reach out. She's going to reach out to my family friend. In the meantime, I have Ellie with me who's feeling, getting a little antsy. I'm going to go bring her to my neighbor's house, see if my neighbor can hold her in her backyard for a little bit while I sort out and figure out what's going on. So hang up the phone. My mom contacts our family friend. I bring Ellie up to our neighbors. Luckily, my neighbor is there. She gives me about 40 minutes to hold Ellie before she has to leave. So I come back to the house, contact my mom again. My mom's gotten in touch with my family friend. Family friend's like, yeah, she can come to my work right now. She just has to get a ride there and she can get the key. I'm like, okay, inconvenient, but I have to do this. I will ask a neighbor to drive me to my family friend's workplace, get the key, I get back in the house. Hang up the phone, okay? And then I have an oh shit moment. Oh shit. I had forgotten that I left a pot of water boiling on the stovetop as I brought Ellie out for her walk because I thought to myself, oh, this will be convenient. I'll have the pot of water on the stovetop so that when I get back from Ellie taking Ellie out, it'll be boiling and then I can just make my food from there. So now I am locked out of this house. No phone, no keys, no wallet, and there is a pot of boiling water on the stovetop. It's been about 10 to 15 minutes. I don't quite know how long. I don't know how much water is left in that pot. And that is when the panic and the fear sets in. And that's where we're going to be taking this conversation today of how we navigate those panic and those stress moments.
Are you do you want to leave us on this cliffhanger? Do you want to like spark notes the ending that like is everything okay and worked out, or like will we get to that after?
we can I can say happily say that everything is okay now.
Okay.
I would love to talk about what is going on with us in those moments of stress, of panic, because in that moment, I was like, oh shit, I made a big mistake. I have no way of getting into this house right now. If I take a car to my family friend's workplace
Right.
and back, that'll be like 40 minutes. What is going to happen in the meantime there? So before we get into what actually happened, let's talk about that stress moment, that panic moment. And I know what was happening within me, but I would love to ask you from your clinical psychology standpoint, like what is happening in our minds in those moments of stress, panic, if you call it anything specific too.
I mean, I think it's that. It's like your fight or flight response. Your nervous system is like kicking on and ready to go to literally like figure out what to do to prevent the house from burning down. And like while sometimes that response turns on and it's not helpful, I think like in this moment, you needed that adrenaline. You needed like your brain to like figure out what to do. Your nervous system like turns on and is like, okay, like we're going to have to like climb a tree or do something, break the door down. Like something has to happen here because the consequence is that like the house could burn down, you know?
Yeah, it really was. That was a moment that made me realize like I don't have time. Like I don't have an abundance of time right now where it's like I can mosey on over to my family friends. Like this has to be solved right now. And I know for me, like the bodily response was what I felt right away of like the starting to like kind of shake a little bit
Mm-hmm.
and starting to tense up. And I think through all of the conversations that we share and all of the work that we do, I was able to not let my mind go to that place that like, oh my God, the house is going to burn down, because that isn't helpful in the
Right.
moment. It's where like our ego might take us, right? Like we're automatically thinking the worst, but that isn't helpful. And so, what I found helpful for myself in that moment was like just zeroing in on, okay, what can I do in this moment?
Mm-hmm. Which is exactly what you should do in that moment, or what I would suggest that you do in that moment. Like, instead of just frantically worrying about the worst case scenario or like the potential outcomes, it's it's zooming in on what is within reach and what can I do in this moment right now to solve this problem or like get some momentum going here.
Yep. Yeah. And luckily, I had that landline phone. You know,
Mhm.
that was really helpful. Of course, like that was like my saving grace to have that landline phone. And so I remember I picked up the phone and called my mom again. And I was so nervous because, you know, this was a big, uh-oh, like this was not just a minor, like, oh, you got locked out of the house. It's like, Devon, this was really not a smart move on your end. And so when I called her, I'm like, okay, mom, I made a really big mistake. I just need you to like bear with me here. And I told her I had a pot of water on the stove, and she's like, okay, so now you need to get in the house.
Mhm.
And we're like brainstorming. We're like, all right, I'm going to call 911. I call 911 and I'm explaining the situation to them. And luckily, within minutes, the police officers show up at the house, and I'm like, all right, we're in a really big pickle here. And, you know, they're walking around the house to see if maybe any of the lower windows are open, which they aren't. They ask me if I'm okay with them like breaking down the door. And I'm like, I guess at this point, and they're like, we don't want the house to blow up. I'm like, yeah, I don't want the house to blow up either.
Right.
They, and then I have a realization my bedroom window is unlocked. My bedroom is on the second floor, but my bedroom window is unlocked. And luckily, we have a ladder in the garage that does extend up the entirety of the house. So, police officer takes the ladder, extends the ladder up the side of the house. At this time, the fire department shows up. It's a whole big spectacle at the DeGilio household here. Fire department shows up, but the police officer is already on the ladder, opens my bedroom window, climbs through the window, makes his way downstairs, turns off the stove, and then opens the door for us. And when we get back into the house, he shows me the pot of water had this much water left. And for
Oh my
those who
God.
aren't watching the video, it was like half of an inch of water left in that pot before all of the water had evaporated.
That's insane.
Yeah, yes, it was. And it was also like such a literal metaphor for how I was feeling that week
Mm.
of like being locked outside of my house with none of my belongings and a pot of boiling water on the stovetop. Like, but before we get into that, I would love to hear from your standpoint, just any, therapy thoughts that came up during that share.
Well, I mean, I think you did all of the things that, like, obviously you could do. It would be really easy in those moments to panic and to like cry or get overwhelmed, but I think you were able to like channel that well. The first thing I'm always telling people, I use the analogy a lot, like we go into fight or flight when we see a bear, right? Like, and when you see a bear, yes, you want to fight it off or run away or like do something that matches that threat response matches the threat itself. Your threat here of the house blowing up or burning down is pretty big, right? Like that matters very much. So your trembling or like worried response matched the threat. Like there was an actual serious threat here. And I think you handled it really well in just focusing on like, what can I do? What do I need to do? Let me drop Ellie off. Let me call my mom. Okay, we actually like don't have time to go to the family friend's office. Like the police need to come. Like we need to figure out something pretty quickly because like quite literally time was ticking. So, I mean, I think the difference, and this isn't related to your situation, but the difference is like your nervous system did a good job, right? It responded appropriately to the size of the threat. Whereas sometimes I think we have a tendency to respond, for example, like a big example is like when someone texts you and says like we need to talk. I think we sometimes have a similar threat response to that, right? Like I might start trembling, my heart starts racing, like I start to panic about that, but like that text, that threat isn't the same as the threat of like your house almost blowing up.
That's a really good point. Yes, because oftentimes it is the same nervous system response, regardless of whether there is a physical or literal threat or not. In this case, yes, there was a literal physical threat. So thank you for bringing that up too, because in that moment, all parts of me were very honed in on, okay, what do I need to do in this moment to get back to safety? And that was certainly very helpful. And then after the fact, after the police officers and the firefighters left, and I got Ellie back and I put the key back in its, the spare key back in its place and, was back in my house safe and sound, that is when I felt like the most reactive, the most emotionally reactive. And so we talk about what's happening in the mind and body during a stress and a crisis moment. I think it's also equally important to talk about what happens after a stressful crisis moment in the mind and the body.
Well, my first thought is like, that's exactly why I'm always saying there's a function to being able to shelf our emotions and not feel them. Because when you're worried about the pot of water running out of water or like the time is ticking, that isn't necessarily the most helpful and appropriate time to sit and like wallow in all of the emotions of like guilt and shame and sadness and frustration. Like those feelings aren't helpful in surviving this moment. So we have this natural tendency to be able to shelf them. And I'm always also saying, do that when you need to do that, and then come back and pick those emotions up, take them off the shelf, and like then you go through and process. So I think you did something really natural by waiting until everything was back in its place. And then you kind of like take that deep breath and you're like, wow, let's sit with these feelings because that was like a lot that we just went through.
It's a lot. Reality starts to settle in. You realize just like how much you had to hold it all together. And so this really does speak to the conversation that we've shared in the past of like making sure that you have those safe spaces for you to express and process and release. And in those moments, like having my mom was really helpful. I called my sister to share the story with her. I was sharing the story with my neighbor, and they all said that the same thing, which was really helpful to hear, was that like what's most important is that you're safe.
Mm-hmm.
And that aside from that pot of water on the stovetop, you did everything that you needed to do. And sometimes we need that validation from others. That's why it's so helpful to share our stories so that we can receive that validation like you're safe. Everything's okay. You maybe could have done better here, but what matters most is that no one was harmed. Everyone's good. And like even me as a 31-year-old adult, I needed to hear that. Like I felt like I was a child and somebody was telling me it's okay, you're safe, you're
Mm-hmm.
good, but I really did need to hear that in that moment.
Yeah. Because it didn't for 15, 20 minutes of that day when that crisis situation was happening. You didn't know if you were safe. You didn't know if everything was going to be okay. So it's super important to come back to those reminders when you are safe and when the situation has passed, when the threat is over. I think we do need to sit and like feel our way through that, but also remind ourselves and have those like positive reminders and affirmations and like the reality of the situation is that like I am safe now. Let me pull out the lessons, right? Because again, that's the function of like anxiety and stress in that situation is like, okay, probably shouldn't go out with the stove on next time. Noted, right? Like lesson learned. And we're okay. We're safe. Like we don't need to live in that like guilt. We can learn from it and move forward knowing that like we're safe and we're okay now.
Mm. Exactly what you just said there too is what my sister said to me. My sister's also a therapist, go figure, and she said something along those lines of like, you know, you don't have to give attention to that anxiety because you are safe.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I want to speak to this too. Like, it's not just about having somebody reassure you that it's safe, it's all good. It's also having somebody reassure you, like, that was a scary situation. Like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that was really stressful. And we've talked about that before, I think, in the like emotions conversation that we had and embracing our sensitivities and whatnot, that we don't want to bypass those emotions because a situation like that, and again, whether it was a literal physical threat or not, the way that our nervous system responds, it doesn't know the difference between what is real and what is not. And so in those moments, I know with the clients that I work with, especially too, I'm affirming to them, like, yeah, that was probably really upsetting, really activating for your nervous system. So let's validate that. And also, then let's turn to the practices that we have to move the energy throughout your body to re regulate your nervous system. And that's what I did in that scenario after getting off the phone with my people is I brought movement into my body. I stretched and I realized just how tight my body was because you're holding everything together for X amount of time and you're not realizing that in those moments of like holding yourself together, like it's blocking like the energy flow throughout your body. And so when you finally have that space to let go, that's when the emotions will start to surface. That's when maybe like the thoughts will start to arise. And so I think my biggest point in talking about the body and the bodily response there and how to tend to that, it's like giving yourself the space after a stressful or overwhelming or panic filled moment to tune into your body and to restore that flow of energy throughout your body and thus regulating your nervous system.
It's exactly why we are capable of mind wandering. And everything that we're talking about today is all to me like two sides of a coin or a double edged sword or like whatever the sayings are. Because I think like we've talked about how we want to be more mindful and more present. But in this situation, I actually would encourage you or someone to mind wander. Go back to those feelings that you put on the shelf, take them off the shelf, talk about them so that you can check that need of feeling seen or feeling heard, feeling understood. Go back and process those feelings so that you can learn the lessons that they're here to teach, so that you can learn from the situation. Like, we need to mentally go back and walk through all that we weren't able to walk through when we were going through the crisis. When you were in the situation, you were in survival mode. Like, all the rest of your brain kind of turns off and you focus on getting through this situation. After the fact, we do need to do that mind wandering and go back in and process through all of that, like you're saying, so that we can release it, so it doesn't live on that shelf, so it's not in this box on the shelf that gets dusty over time, and it's something that like we have to carry around. I think of that as when people talk about like having emotional baggage. To me, it's all the things that you've shelved over your life and don't process through. So I actually love that you took that time and dedicated that time to taking those things and working through that, both through movement, through the emotional processing, through talking to people, because I think that is how you clear it and don't harbor it.
That's a great visualization of, yeah, more often than not, we do shelf our emotions, the aftermath of stressful situations, right? Because we just think, like, oh, time to carry on with life as if it didn't happen. And if we don't do that, I mean, I see it from the energetic standpoint. It's like energy needs to come up and be seen, be expressed, be released. And if we're not bringing awareness to it, if we're not taking the time to process, we're just shoving it back down. And eventually there's going to be like this, I see it as like a volcanic eruption
Mm-hmm.
after X amount of time of ignoring it. So, yeah, for me, there was no pushing it back down because it was all very, very present for me. And what you said too of the, what did you call it? Oh, what you said too, the mind wandering, like getting curious about what it had to show you, what lessons were there. Like, this is where I actually think we bring in a lot of spiritual awareness to our experiences. Because when we have taken care of the scenario in the moment, when we have come back to a place of safety, when we have processed, then we can bring in that spiritual awareness where we're like, okay, what is this really showing me? Like, what did this show me about my capacity or my capability to handle a stressful moment? What existed or what was in place around me to help me in this scenario? Like, thank goodness I had a landline phone. Thank goodness I had a mom pick up her phone. Thank goodness I had a neighbor take Ellie, and thank goodness the police responded right away. I mean, I had not only the police, but I also had the firefighters. Thank goodness my window happened to be unlocked, and thank goodness there was a ladder in the garage. Like, there's just so many little, I call them like little miracles or blessings that existed in that moment to help me feel taken care of. And that's what I mean by spiritual awareness. Spiritual awareness is understanding that you're not alone. We are surrounded by so much support and so much love. We just have to open our eyes to it. We've talked about this in the past, but I think that we can't get there without first addressing the mind and the body components of it all.
I actually agree with you entirely there, because I think that's where positivity, spirituality feels toxic to people sometimes, because I think that all is true, right? Like, how ironic and how amazing that these, like, that your window was unlocked and that there was this perfectly like heighted or like sized ladder like around the corner of the house. All of these things I think are amazing. And I can see how someone wouldn't be able to hear that or wouldn't be able to tolerate the beauty of that if they hadn't yet flushed out or like moved through those feelings. Like if they're still stuck in the more like negative, I know we don't like that word, but like the more negative feelings, like the guilt, the shame, the sadness, the frustration, we're not able to then access the gratitude that you're speaking to. And that's exactly why it's so important to feel those feelings so that you can release their energy and not harbor it and not have to walk around feeling all of that negativity, because then we're lighter, we have the capacity and the space to then hold the gratitude and the acceptance and the appreciation for like all of the miracles that did happen in that situation.
Exactly. I will be the first person to welcome anybody into this spiritual woo woo world of mine. And also, I'm going to be clear that it's not just angel numbers and synchronicities, right? We've had a whole conversation on that. Like, you have to, if you're going to do it well, if you're going to embrace a more like spiritual mindset or practice, it's also accepting that you have to involve the mind and the body and, some of those parts of us that we typically like to avoid or ignore, or in this case, bypass, but you really can't, because the clarity in the lesson comes after all of that.
Yeah, it's giving like a very full circle experience and like almost that like you can't unlock, not that you can't, you can do whatever you want, but like it's you have to kind of move through like the nervous system response and be there in that moment and work through that. And then you kind of level up to the emotional stuff and processing the things that like you had shelved and sitting with that, the energy, the emotion, seeking support, like doing all of the emotional stuff. And then next comes that like spiritual piece of like being able to see the miracles and have the gratitude and experience the whole, or like see the whole experience for like all that it was, not just like one or the other.
Hmm. Yeah, you just beautifully summed it up. So, yeah, as we are wrapping up this episode, positive news, everybody is safe. No harm was done to the house, to anybody involved. And also, I made sure to care for myself and to walk away with some lessons learned. So, thank you, Heather, for inviting me to speak to this story. And as always, diving deep into what we mean when we say the mind, body, soul connection. Always helpful conversations. Anything that you want to add as we wrap up?
I think the thing that I thought of was the saying be where your feet are, and like where your feet were during the crisis was in the crisis situation. So be there and figure that out. And then next, like I think you were called to like take that deep breath. You put the key away and then there's this like whew, oh my gosh, moment. That's where you are then, right? Then you're in the next phase of like being able to like work through that and be there. And then I think you were kind of like naturally able to recognize the miracles that happened. And that's then where you were. So, like, while it's not always necessarily where your literal feet are, like, be where you are. And if you're feeling called to process these feelings, it's probably because there's some stuff you got on the shelf there to like work through, and do that. But also know you don't have to do that alone. Like you went to your neighbor, your sister, your mom, your people. Go to them and come to us, your coaches, your therapists, your healers, and feel the feelings.
Beautifully summed. Yes, be where your feet are. And also know that you have so much support that is available to you in any given moment. So
Yeah.
I think that's a perfect way to end this conversation. And I think that can just be our vision board, send off message from there. Be where your feet are.
Be where your feet are. Thank you for bringing it in. Thank you for everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. We are so glad that you took the time to share this space with us. We'll be releasing new episodes of Mind Meets Body and Soul every Tuesday, so be sure to give us a follow and share this podcast with those you love.
To connect with us and join our communities, head to the show notes where you'll find our contact information and individual websites. Until next week, stay grounded, keep growing, and trust that everything you seek is unfolding for you.